David adjusted his tie one more time as he stood outside the towering glass building. 27 floors of gleaming steel and ambition stretched above him into the cloudy morning sky. Sterling and Partners was written in bold letters across the entrance, and today would be his first day as a senior consultant at one of the most respected firms in the city. He had worked 5 years to get here. 5 years of grinding through late nights, weekend projects, and proving himself over and over again at his previous company. His MBA from a top university sat framed on his desk back home, right next to the recommendation letters that had helped him land this dream job. But standing here now, David felt something he hadn't expected. A knot in his stomach that had nothing to do with first-day nerves. The lobby was everything he had imagined. Marble floors reflected the soft lighting, and expensive artwork lined the walls. Professional-looking people in sharp suits moved with purpose, their heels clicking against the polished stone. David approached the reception desk where a woman with perfectly styled blonde hair looked up at him with a polite but distant smile. "Can I help you?" she asked, her eyes scanning him from head to toe in a way that made him suddenly aware of every detail of his appearance. "I'm David Rodriguez. It's my first day as a senior consultant," he said, trying to sound confident. The receptionist's eyebrows raised slightly. She glanced at her computer screen, then back at him. "Oh," she said, the surprise clear in her voice. "Yes, I see you here. Let me call someone to escort you up." While he waited, David noticed how other new arrivals were greeted. A young man in an expensive suit walked in, and the receptionist immediately brightened. "You must be here for the Goldman account meeting," she said warmly, even though the man hadn't identified himself. "Take the express elevator to the 15th floor." David's escort arrived a few minutes later. A junior assistant who looked barely out of college led him through a maze of hallways to the elevator. "So," she said, making small talk, "what department are you with? Are you here for maintenance or maybe IT support?" "Actually, I'm the new senior consultant," David replied. The assistant's face flushed red. "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I just assumed—" She trailed off, clearly embarrassed. When the elevator doors opened on the 20th floor, David stepped into a world that felt both familiar and foreign. Open workspaces filled with busy professionals, conference rooms with glass walls, and the constant hum of important conversations. This was exactly the kind of environment he had prepared for his entire career, yet something felt off. His new manager, Richard Thompson, greeted him with a firm handshake and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Richard was everything David had expected from their phone interviews. Mid-40s, perfectly groomed with the kind of confidence that came from never having to prove himself to anyone. "Welcome to Sterling and Partners," Richard said, leading David toward his new desk. "I have to say your resume is quite impressive. 5 years at Morrison Consulting, and those client satisfaction scores were outstanding." David smiled, feeling some of his nervousness ease. "Thank you. I'm excited to bring that experience to your team." "Yes, well, we'll see how you adapt to our culture here," Richard replied. "Things move pretty fast, and our clients have very specific expectations." The tour continued through the office, with Richard introducing David to various team members. Each introduction followed a similar pattern. Polite smiles, brief handshakes, and then a subtle shift in conversation as people seemed to size him up. David noticed how their eyes lingered on his face, as if trying to figure out where exactly he fit in their carefully ordered world. "This is David, our new senior consultant," Richard would say, and then, almost without fail, someone would ask, "Oh, where did you go to school?" Or, "What was your previous company like?" The questions weren't unusual, but there was something in the tone that suggested they were looking for specific answers. During his first team meeting, David sat around a polished conference table with 6 other consultants. The conversation flowed easily among his new colleagues as they discussed ongoing projects and client relationships. Names of prestigious universities were dropped casually into conversation. References to exclusive golf clubs and weekend homes created an invisible web of shared experiences that David couldn't quite access. When Richard asked for input on a new project proposal, David raised his hand. "I worked on something similar at my previous company," he began. "We found that clients responded better when we approached the problem from a different angle." The room went quiet. David explained his idea, drawing from his extensive experience and proven track record. When he finished, there was a moment of silence before Richard nodded politely. "Interesting perspective," Richard said. but I think we'll stick with our standard approach for now. It's worked well for our clients in the past." 20 minutes later, David watched in amazement as another team member presented almost the exact same idea, just worded differently. This time, Richard leaned forward with interest. "Now that's innovative thinking," Richard said. "Let's definitely explore that option." David caught the eye of the colleague who had just repeated his suggestion. The man shrugged slightly, but there was no apology in his expression. Just a look that seemed to say, "That's how things work here." As the meeting continued, David began to notice other patterns. When he spoke, people seemed to half listen, their attention drifting to phones or papers. When others contributed, even junior team members, the room gave them full attention. Ideas flowed freely, building on each other, creating the kind of collaborative energy that David had always thrived in. Except he wasn't really part of it. After the meeting, David returned to his desk feeling confused and frustrated. He had prepared extensively for this job, researching the company culture and studying their client base. His qualifications were solid, his experience relevant, and his track record spoke for itself. So why did he feel like he was fighting an uphill battle just to be heard? His computer had been set up with all the necessary access, and he dove into reviewing current projects. The work itself was familiar territory. Client needs, strategic planning, implementation timelines. This was exactly what he had been doing successfully for years. But every time he looked up from his screen, he caught glimpses of conversations happening without him. Informal discussions about strategy, client preferences, and office politics that seemed to flow around him like water around a stone. At lunch, David found himself eating alone in the company cafeteria. He had expected to grab lunch with his new team, but no one had mentioned any plans. Around him, tables were filled with animated conversations and easy laughter. He recognized faces from his floor, but no one seemed to notice him sitting there. The afternoon brought his first client call. Richard had mentioned that David would be observing initially, just to get a feel for how Sterling and Partners handled their relationships. The client was a major technology company looking to restructure their operations, exactly the kind of project David had led successfully in his previous role. During the call, David listened as his new colleagues presented ideas that were solid but conventional. He could see opportunities they were missing, approaches that could save the client both time and money. But when he tried to contribute, his suggestions were politely acknowledged and then quickly moved past. After the call ended, Richard pulled David aside. "Just a heads up," he said quietly. "Our clients here are used to a certain type of consultant. It might be best if you observe for a while longer before jumping in with suggestions." David nodded, but inside alarm bells were starting to ring. A certain type of consultant? He had never heard that phrase used to describe anything other than experience level or expertise area. But the way Richard said it suggested something else entirely. Walking back to his desk, David passed a group of his new colleagues gathered around someone's computer, laughing at something on the screen. As he approached, the laughter died down, and the group dispersed with polite nods in his direction. The easy camaraderie that had been flowing freely just moments before seemed to evaporate in his presence. By the end of his first day, David felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with learning new systems or meeting new people. It was the exhaustion that came from constantly being on guard, from second-guessing every interaction, from feeling like he was speaking a language that everyone else understood, but somehow he was using the wrong accent. As he packed up his briefcase, David tried to shake off the day's experiences. Maybe it was just typical first-day awkwardness. Maybe he was reading too much into polite professional distance. Maybe tomorrow would be different. But as he walked toward the elevator, David overheard a conversation that made his stomach drop. Two of his colleagues were discussing the day's client call, and one of them mentioned his name. "I don't know what Richard was thinking," the voice said. "The clients are going to expect a certain level of, well, someone who really fits their expectations." The elevator doors opened and David stepped inside, the conversation fading behind him. As he rode down to the lobby, David stared at his reflection in the polished metal doors. Same expensive suit, same confident posture, same qualifications that had gotten him here. But somehow in this building, all of that seemed to count for less than something he couldn't change and shouldn't have to. 3 months had passed since David's first day at Sterling and Partners, and what he had hoped were just initial growing pains had settled into a frustrating pattern. Every morning he arrived at the office with the same determination to prove himself, and every evening he left feeling like he was swimming against an invisible current. The work itself wasn't the problem. David excelled at the technical aspects of consulting. His project analyses were thorough, his client recommendations were sound, and his implementation plans consistently delivered results. But somehow none of that seemed to matter in the ways that counted. Take the Morrison account, for example. David had spent 2 weeks developing a comprehensive strategy to help the client streamline their supply chain operations. His proposal could save them over $2 million annually, while improving efficiency by 30%. The numbers were solid, backed by detailed research and market analysis that drew from his extensive experience in similar projects. During the presentation meeting, David watched as Richard introduced his proposal to the senior partners. But as Richard spoke, David noticed subtle changes in the language and approach. The innovative elements that made David's strategy unique were downplayed, while more conventional aspects were emphasized. When questions arose about the more creative solutions, Richard deflected them with phrases like, "We'll need to study that further," or "That might be too aggressive for this client." After the meeting, David approached Richard privately. "I noticed some of my key recommendations were modified," he said carefully. "The client seemed interested in the cost-saving measures I outlined." Richard smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't invite further discussion. "David, you have to understand our clients here. They're conservative, traditional companies. They want to work with consultants who understand their culture and speak their language. Sometimes the best ideas need to be presented in the right way by the right person." The message was clear, even though Richard never said it directly. David's ideas might be good, but David himself wasn't the right messenger for Sterling and Partners clientele. This became even more apparent during client dinners and networking events. David would receive invitations to these gatherings, which seemed like a positive sign. He would dress carefully, prepare talking points about current projects, and arrive ready to build the kind of professional relationships that were essential for success in consulting. But once he arrived, David often felt like he was attending a different event than everyone else. Conversations flowed easily around him, touching on shared experiences he couldn't access. References to exclusive prep schools, family vacation homes, and social connections created an intricate web of familiarity that David could observe but never truly join. At a dinner with the executives from Pinnacle Industries, David found himself seated between 2 senior partners from Sterling and Partners. The conversation ranged from golf courses to wine collections to prep school memories. When David tried to contribute his own perspectives on industry trends or strategic insights, the responses were polite but brief, and the conversation quickly returned to more personal territory. So David, one of the Pinnacle executives, finally addressed him directly. "Richard tells me you're from... Where was it again?" "I grew up in Phoenix," David replied. "Went to Arizona State for undergrad, then got my MBA from Northwestern." "Ah," the executive nodded, but David caught the quick glance he exchanged with Richard. "And what does your family do?" It was a loaded question, and David knew it. "My father worked construction and my mother was a teacher," he answered honestly. The conversation moved on quickly after that, but David noticed how the dynamic at the table shifted. He was still included in discussions, but more as an observer than a participant. When strategic topics came up that were directly in his wheelhouse, others would explain concepts to him that he knew better than they did. The exclusion wasn't limited to formal events. The real decisions at Sterling and Partners happened in informal settings that David gradually realized he wasn't part of. Impromptu drinks after work where project assignments were discussed. Weekend golf games where client relationships were built. Casual lunches where strategic directions were debated. David would hear about these gatherings on Monday mornings, when colleagues would reference conversations and decisions that had happened without him. "Oh, we talked about that at dinner Friday night," someone would say when David brought up a project concern. "We decided to go in a different direction." The most frustrating part was watching his own ideas succeed when they were presented by others. The supply chain strategy he had developed for Morrison was eventually implemented, but the credit went to a junior associate who had refined David's work. When the client praised the innovative approach during a follow-up meeting, David sat silently as his colleague accepted the recognition. This pattern repeated itself across multiple projects. David would develop solutions, others would present them, and the success would belong to people who looked and sounded like what Sterling and Partners clients expected. David's contributions were acknowledged in internal documents and project files, but when it came to client-facing recognition or career advancement opportunities, his role seemed to fade into the background. The impact on his performance reviews was subtle but significant. Richard would praise David's technical skills and work quality, but there were always concerns about client development and relationship building. These were areas where David felt he should excel, given his strong track record at his previous company. But at Sterling and Partners, his client interactions were increasingly limited to behind-the-scenes analysis, while others handled the relationship management. David's analytical work is excellent, Richard wrote in one quarterly review, but he needs to work on developing the executive presence that our clients expect. Recommendation: focus on observing how senior consultants manage client relationships and gradually increase involvement as comfort level grows. Reading those words, David felt a familiar frustration. Executive presence, client comfort level. These were code words for something that had nothing to do with his abilities or qualifications. He had successfully managed client relationships for 5 years at Morrison Consulting, building trust and delivering results that led to contract renewals and referrals. But somehow at Sterling and Partners, those same skills didn't translate. The breaking point came during a project with Celestial Technologies, a Fortune 500 company looking to expand into international markets. David had extensive experience with global market entry strategies, having led similar projects that generated millions in new revenue for previous clients. When Richard assigned him to the team, David was optimistic that this would be his chance to demonstrate his full capabilities. The initial research phase went well. David's analysis of potential markets was comprehensive and insightful, identifying opportunities that others had missed. His risk assessment was thorough, and his implementation timeline was realistic and achievable. When the team gathered to prepare their presentation for Celestial's executive committee, David felt confident that his work would speak for itself. But during the preparation meeting, David watched as his strategy was dissected and redistributed among other team members. His market analysis became background research. His implementation plan was simplified and assigned to someone else to present. His risk assessment was incorporated into a broader overview that would be delivered by Richard himself. "What exactly will I be presenting?" David asked when the assignments were finished. Richard looked up from his notes with surprise, as if David's question was unexpected. "Oh, you'll be there for support, of course, to answer any detailed questions about the research. Sometimes it's better to have the person who did the deep analysis available for follow-up rather than trying to present everything themselves." David felt something crack inside his chest. Support follow-up questions. After 6 months at one of the most prestigious consulting firms in the city, he was being relegated to the role of a research assistant at the most important presentation he had worked on. That evening, David sat in his apartment reviewing the presentation materials. Every slide, every recommendation, every strategic insight bore his fingerprints. This was his work, his expertise, his contribution to what would likely be a multi-million-dollar engagement for Sterling and Partners. But tomorrow, he would sit in the corner of the conference room while others took credit for his ideas and built relationships with clients who would never know his name. David opened his laptop and began documenting everything. Not just the Celestial project, but all the patterns he had observed over the past 6 months. The ideas that had been reassigned, the client meetings he had been excluded from, the networking events where he was present but not truly included, the performance reviews that criticized him for failing to develop relationships he wasn't allowed to build. As he typed, David realized that his experience at Sterling and Partners wasn't about his performance or potential. It was about something much more fundamental, something that no amount of hard work or excellent results could change. The company had hired him, but they had never really intended for him to succeed in the ways that mattered. But David had not survived 5 years in consulting by giving up when things got difficult. He had built his career by finding solutions to complex problems, and now he was facing the most complex problem of his professional life. Sterling and partners might have their own ideas about what he could and couldn't accomplish, but David was beginning to form some ideas of his own. The presentation to Celestial Technologies was scheduled for next Thursday. David would be there, sitting in his assigned supporting role, watching others present his work to executives who had the power to change his career trajectory. But for the first time since starting at Sterling and Partners, David wasn't planning to just sit quietly and hope for the best. He was planning to take control of his own story, even if no one saw it coming. The presentation to Celestial Technologies went exactly as David had expected, which made it even more painful to watch. For 45 minutes he sat in the corner of the gleaming conference room, while Richard and two junior associates presented his strategy as if they had conceived it themselves. The Celestial executives asked thoughtful questions about market penetration strategies, competitive analysis, and implementation timelines. All questions that David could have answered in detail, since he had developed every aspect of the proposal. Instead, he watched Richard stumble through explanations of concepts that David had researched extensively. When the Celestial CEO asked about potential regulatory challenges in the Southeast Asian markets, Richard gave a generic response that barely scratched the surface of the complex legal landscape David had mapped out in his analysis. Actually, David found himself saying, before he could stop himself, there are specific regulatory frameworks in Thailand and Vietnam that could significantly impact the timeline. The room turned to look at him. Richard's expression flashed with something between surprise and annoyance, but the Celestial executives leaned forward with interest. Could you elaborate on that? The CEO asked. David spent the next 10 minutes providing detailed insights that he had gathered through weeks of research and conversations with international trade experts. The executives took notes, asked follow-up questions, and by the end of his explanation, the energy in the room had shifted. They were looking at him with the kind of respect and attention that David had been craving for months. After the presentation ended and the Celestial team left, Richard waited until they were alone before approaching David. His smile was tight, and his voice carried an edge that David had never heard before. That was interesting, Richard said. Next time, it might be better to stick to the planned presentation flow. Our clients prefer a coordinated approach rather than spontaneous additions. David felt his jaw clench. The CEO asked a direct question about regulatory issues. I have 6 months of research on that exact topic. I understand, Richard replied. But you have to think about how it looks when someone who wasn't supposed to be presenting suddenly takes over the conversation. It can be confusing for clients who expect to know who they're working with. The message was crystal clear. David might have the expertise, but he wasn't supposed to demonstrate it in front of clients. His role was to provide the knowledge that others would present and receive credit for. 2 weeks later, David learned that Sterling and Partners had won the Celestial contract. It was a $12 million engagement that would run for 18 months, making it one of the largest deals the firm had secured that year. Richard was praised by the senior partners for his strategic vision and client development skills. The junior associates who had participated in the presentation received promotions and were assigned to lead roles on the implementation. Team David received a brief email thanking him for his research, support, and informing him that he would be transitioning to a new project with a smaller client. That afternoon, David sat in his cubicle staring at his computer screen, but not really seeing the spreadsheet in front of him. Around him, his colleagues were celebrating the Celestial win with champagne that Richard had brought in for the team. Conversations buzzed with excitement about the project scope, the prestige of working with such a high-profile client, and the career opportunities that would come from a successful implementation. David had not been invited to participate in the celebration. He was still sitting there an hour later when Kevin Walsh approached his desk. Kevin was one of the junior associates who had been promoted after the Celestial presentation, and David had watched him climb the Sterling and Partners hierarchy with a speed that seemed effortless. Kevin had graduated from Harvard Business School 2 years ago, and his father was a senior partner at a competing consulting firm. Everything about Kevin's trajectory at Sterling and Partners seemed to follow a predetermined path. "Hey, David," Kevin said, perching on the edge of David's desk with casual familiarity. "Richard wanted me to talk to you about something." David looked up, noting that Kevin didn't seem uncomfortable or apologetic about the conversation they were about to have. If anything, he appeared confident, as if he was doing David a favor. "Sure," David replied. "What's going on?" Kevin glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard, then leaned closer. "Look, I know the celestial thing was frustrating for you. You did a lot of good work on that project. But Richard's concerned that you might not be the best fit for our larger corporate clients." David felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What do you mean?" "Come on, David. You're smart enough to see what's happening here. Our clients have certain expectations about who they want representing Sterling and Partners. It's not about your qualifications or your work quality. It's about fit." David stared at Kevin, waiting for him to say something that would make this conversation less awful than it was becoming. Kevin continued, his voice taking on a tone that David had heard before from well-meaning people who thought they were being helpful. "Richard's thinking it might be better if you focused on our smaller clients. You know, companies that might be more comfortable with someone like you. There's a great opportunity coming up with some community development organizations and minority-owned businesses. You'd be perfect for that kind of work." The words hit David like a physical blow. Someone like you. Minority-owned businesses. After 8 months of watching his ideas succeed under other people's names, after developing strategies that had generated millions in revenue for Sterling and Partners, after proving his expertise on every project he touched, David was being relegated to what amounted to a diversity consulting role. "And what if I'm not interested in being pigeonholed into that kind of work?" David asked, his voice carefully controlled. Kevin shrugged, and for the first time his expression showed a hint of discomfort. "Then I think you're going to have a difficult time here. Sterling and Partners has a certain culture, certain expectations. Fighting against that isn't going to help your career." After Kevin walked away, David sat in stunned silence. The office continued to buzz around him, but he felt completely disconnected from everything happening. Colleagues discussed upcoming projects, weekend plans, and office gossip, but their voices seemed to be coming from another world entirely. David realized that Kevin had just offered him a choice, though not the kind of choice that anyone should have to make. He could accept the role they were prepared to give him, working with smaller, less prestigious clients while watching others build careers on his ideas and expertise. Or he could continue fighting for recognition and advancement in a system that had never intended for him to succeed. That evening, David called his mentor from business school, Professor Martinez, who had helped him navigate the transition into consulting 5 years earlier. "I've been wondering when I'd hear from you," Professor Martinez said after David explained his situation. "How long has this been going on?" "Since day one," David admitted. "But I kept thinking it would get better. I kept believing that good work would eventually speak for itself." Professor Martinez was quiet for a moment. "David, I've seen this pattern too many times. Companies like Sterling and Partners hire people like you because they need to, not because they want to. They'll take your ideas, benefit from your expertise, and find ways to limit your advancement without technically violating any discrimination laws. So what are my options?" David asked. "Well," Professor Martinez said, "you could take Kevin's advice and accept the limited role they're offering, or you could fight back. But if you choose to fight, you need to be strategic about it. You need to think like the consultant you are and develop a plan that gives you leverage." After hanging up, David spent the rest of the evening thinking about Professor Martinez's words. Leverage. In consulting, leverage meant having something that the other party needed more than you needed what they were offering. David had been operating from a position of weakness, hoping for recognition and advancement from people who had no intention of providing either. But what if he changed the equation? What if he found a way to make Sterling and Partners need him more than he needed them? David opened his laptop and began researching something he should have investigated months ago. Employment law, documentation requirements, and the legal landscape around workplace discrimination. But more importantly, he began reviewing his client files and contact lists from his previous job. If Sterling and Partners wanted to limit his role within their existing client base, maybe it was time to expand that client base in ways they hadn't anticipated. David had built strong relationships during his 5 years at Morrison Consulting. Relationships that hadn't disappeared just because he had changed companies. As he worked through the night, David began to see possibilities that he hadn't considered before. Sterling and Partners might control how they presented him to their current clients, but they couldn't control what potential clients thought about his expertise. They might limit his role in existing projects, but they couldn't prevent him from developing new opportunities. By morning, David had the outline of a plan that was risky, ambitious, and potentially career-defining. It was also the first thing he had felt genuinely excited about since starting at Sterling & Partners. Kevin Walsh had offered David a choice between accepting limitations or facing difficulties. But David was beginning to realize that there was a third option that Kevin and Richard had never considered. David could stop asking for permission and start taking control. The game was about to change, and David was ready to play by his own rules. David's transformation began quietly, during lunch breaks and after hours when the Sterling & Partners office was mostly empty. While his colleagues assumed he was accepting his diminished role, David was actually building something they couldn't see. He had learned that the game wasn't about fighting within their system. It was about creating his own. The first call David made was to Jennifer Chen, the CEO of NextGen Solutions, a rapidly growing tech company he had helped during his time at Morrison Consulting. Jennifer's company had grown from 50 employees to over 500 in the past 2 years, and David knew they were looking for strategic consulting support to manage their expansion. "David," Jennifer's voice was warm with genuine enthusiasm when he reached her. "I was just thinking about you last week. We're dealing with some complex operational challenges, and your name came up in our leadership meeting." This was exactly what David had hoped to hear. During his Morrison days, he had helped NextGen navigate a critical product launch that had generated over $30 million in new revenue. Jennifer remembered not just the results he had delivered, but the way he had worked, as a true partner who understood her business rather than an outsider trying to impose generic solutions. "I'd love to discuss how Sterling & Partners might be able to help," David said carefully. "We have some innovative approaches to scaling operations that could be perfect for where NextGen is right now." Jennifer's response surprised him. "Actually, David, I'll be honest with you. We reached out to Sterling & Partners 6 months ago, but we weren't impressed with their initial proposal. It felt very cookie-cutter, like they hadn't really listened to our specific needs. But if you're there now, that changes everything." David felt a shock of realization. Sterling & Partners had already missed an opportunity with NextGen, one of the fastest-growing companies in their target market. And they had missed it because they had approached the engagement with their standard methodology, instead of the customized thinking that David specialized in. Over the next 2 weeks, David had similar conversations with 4 other contacts from his Morrison days. Each call revealed the same pattern: companies that needed sophisticated consulting support, but had been turned off by Sterling & Partners' rigid approach or had never been approached at all because they didn't fit the firm's traditional client profile. What David discovered was that Sterling & Partners, for all their prestige and success, had significant blind spots in their business development. They were excellent at serving Fortune 100 companies that sought conventional solutions, but they struggled to connect with the dynamic, fast-growing companies that represented the future of the market. David began developing detailed proposals for these companies, working evenings and weekends to create strategic plans that addressed their specific challenges. He drew on all the research and analytical tools available through Sterling & Partners, but he approached each engagement with the flexibility and innovation that had made him successful at Morrison. The breakthrough came when NextGen agreed to a preliminary consulting engagement worth $200,000. Jennifer specifically requested that David lead the project, and she made it clear that their continued relationship with Sterling & Partners depended on his involvement. David presented this opportunity to Richard as if it were a routine business development success. "I've been networking with some of my previous contacts," he explained, "and NextGen Solutions is interested in our services for an operation scaling project." Richard's reaction was exactly what David had expected. Mild interest mixed with surprise that David had generated a legitimate lead. "NextGen, I think we've heard of them. Tech company, right? What's the project scope?" David outlined the engagement, emphasizing the revenue potential and the likelihood of additional work if the initial project went well. What he didn't mention was that Jennifer had made his leadership of the project a non-negotiable requirement. "Interesting," Richard said, though his tone suggested he was already thinking about who should actually manage the client relationship. "I'll take a look at this and see who we should assign to lead the engagement." "Actually," David said, keeping his voice casual, "Jennifer specifically asked to work with me. We have a history from my Morrison days, and she's comfortable with my approach to operational challenges." Richard paused, and David could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. A $200,000 engagement was significant, but not so large that it would transform anyone's career. If the client was specifically requesting David, it might be easiest to let him handle it rather than risk losing the business by reassigning the relationship. "Well," Richard said finally, "if that's what the client prefers, I suppose we can accommodate that. But you'll need to keep me closely informed about the project development." David nodded, but inside he was celebrating his first major victory. For the first time since joining Sterling & Partners, he would be leading a client engagement with his name on the project and his strategies driving the work. The Next Gen project launched 3 weeks later, and David threw himself into it with an energy and focus that reminded him why he had chosen consulting in the first place. Working directly with Jennifer and her leadership team, he developed an operational framework that addressed their scaling challenges while positioning them for continued growth. But David was also doing something else that his Sterling & Partners colleagues didn't realize. He was documenting everything. Every successful recommendation, every client interaction, every moment of positive feedback. He was building a portfolio of evidence that demonstrated his capabilities in ways that couldn't be dismissed or reassigned to someone else. 6 weeks into the Next Gen engagement, David received a call that changed everything. Jennifer was calling to discuss expanding the project scope, but she had bigger news to share. "David, I have to tell you something," she said, and he could hear excitement in her voice. "I was having lunch with Patricia Williams from Quantum Industries yesterday, and I couldn't stop talking about the work you're doing with us. Patricia's been looking for consulting support for a major restructuring project, and she asked if I could connect her with you directly." David felt his heart rate accelerate. Quantum Industries was exactly the kind of client that Sterling & Partners considered a crown jewel. A $2 billion manufacturing company with operations across 3 continents. The kind of client that generated multi-million-dollar engagements and built reputations within the consulting industry. "What kind of project is Patricia considering?" David asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Complete organizational restructuring," Jennifer replied. "They're looking at spinning off 2 divisions and consolidating their international operations." She mentioned a budget in the 8-figure range for consulting support. "And David, she specifically said she wants to work with you, not just Sterling & Partners generally." David spent the next hour on the phone with Patricia Williams, discussing Quantum Industries' strategic challenges and potential solutions. By the end of the conversation, Patricia had invited him to present a preliminary proposal to her executive team the following week. This was the moment David had been building toward without fully realizing it. For months, he had been frustrated by his inability to access Sterling & Partners' prestigious clients. But while he had been focused on that limitation, he had inadvertently been building something much more valuable, a network of relationships that valued his specific expertise rather than his company's reputation. David looked around the Sterling & Partners office with new eyes. His colleagues were still operating within the constraints of the firm's existing client relationships and traditional business development approaches. They were competing for advancement within a system that limited who could succeed and how. But David had discovered something that none of them seemed to understand. In today's business environment, relationships and results mattered more than pedigree and positioning. Companies like NextGen and Quantum Industries were looking for consultants who could deliver innovative solutions, not representatives of prestigious firms who followed conventional playbooks. That evening, David called Professor Martinez to update him on the developments. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Professor Martinez said after David explained the situation. "You now have one active client who specifically requested you, and another potential client worth millions who wants to work with you personally?" "That's right," David confirmed. "And your colleagues at Sterling & Partners have no idea that you've essentially become your own business development engine?" David smiled for the first time in months. "They think I'm good at networking. They have no idea that I'm actually building leverage," Professor Martinez laughed. "David, do you realize what you've done? You've created a situation where Sterling & Partners needs you more than you need them. Those clients aren't hiring the firm, they're hiring you." As David hung up the phone, he realized that Professor Martinez was absolutely right. For 8 months, David had been trying to prove himself within Sterling and Partners' existing framework. But while he was focused on that struggle, he had accidentally built something much more powerful. He had become indispensable. Tomorrow, David would present the quantum industry's opportunity to Richard and the senior partners. But this time, he wouldn't be asking for permission to participate in the engagement. He would be explaining how Sterling and Partners could benefit from the relationships he had built and the opportunities he had created. The conversation was going to be very different from any they had anticipated. The senior partners meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. on a Thursday morning. In the glass-walled conference room that David had only seen from the outside during his 8 months at Sterling and Partners. As he walked through the office carrying his presentation materials, David noticed colleagues glancing in his direction with curiosity. Word had spread that he was presenting a potential engagement to the firm's leadership, though no one seemed to know the details. Richard had scheduled the meeting after David informed him about the quantum industry's opportunity. Though Richard's tone suggested he was still processing how David had managed to connect with such a high-profile potential client. "Let's see what they're really interested in," Richard had said, as if David might have misunderstood the scope of Patricia Williams's needs. David entered the conference room to find 5 senior partners seated around the polished table. These were the people who controlled Sterling and Partners' strategic direction, client relationships, and personnel decisions. In 8 months, David had never spoken directly to any of them, though he had seen them in the office and heard their names referenced in the kind of reverent tones usually reserved for celebrities. "David," Richard said, gesturing to a chair at the foot of the table, "thank you for joining us. I understand you have an interesting opportunity to discuss." David had prepared extensively for this moment, but not in the way Richard expected. Instead of simply presenting Quantum Industries as a potential client for Sterling and Partners to pursue, David had crafted a presentation that would fundamentally change how the firm understood his value and position. "Thank you for this opportunity," David began, clicking to his first slide. "I'd like to discuss not just a single client engagement, but a strategic shift that could significantly expand Sterling and Partners' market reach." He could see eyebrows raise around the table. This wasn't the tone they had expected from someone presenting his first business development lead. David's presentation began with an analysis of Sterling and Partners' current client portfolio. Using publicly available data and insights from his industry research, he demonstrated how the firm's focus on traditional Fortune 100 companies was causing them to miss opportunities in the fastest-growing segments of the market. Companies with revenues between $500 million and $2 billion represent the highest growth potential in our industry, David explained, clicking through slides that showed market trends and competitive analysis. These organizations need sophisticated consulting support, but they're often underserved by firms that focus primarily on larger enterprises. The senior partners were paying attention now, leaning forward and taking notes. David could see recognition in their faces as he outlined opportunities they hadn't fully considered. "Over the past 2 months," David continued, "I've been developing relationships with 5 companies in this segment. Companies that have either been poorly served by traditional consulting approaches or haven't been approached at all." David clicked to his next slide, which showed the logos and revenue figures for Next-Gen Solutions, Quantum Industries, and 3 other companies he had been cultivating relationships with. The combined potential revenue from these 5 opportunities exceeded $25 million. The room was completely silent now. David could see Richard's expression shift from casual interest to focused attention as he processed the numbers on the screen. "The key insight," David said, "is that these companies don't just want consulting services. They want consultants who understand their specific challenges and can develop customized solutions rather than applying standard methodologies." David then presented detailed case studies from his work with NextGen, showing measurable results that had already led to expanded project scope and referrals to other potential clients. He outlined his preliminary conversations with Quantum Industries, emphasizing Patricia Williams's specific interest in his approach to organizational restructuring. "What's particularly interesting," David said, clicking to his final slide, "is that these clients are specifically requesting to work with me. Not Sterling and Partners generally, but me specifically. based on my previous work and my approach to their challenges. The silence that followed was different from the polite attention David had received during previous presentations. This was the silence of people realizing that the dynamic in the room had suddenly shifted in ways they hadn't anticipated. Margaret Stevens, the founding partner and most senior member of the group, spoke first. "David, help me understand something. Are you saying that Quantum Industries specifically requested you for their restructuring project?" "That's correct," David replied. "Patricia Williams was referred to me by Jennifer Chen at NextGen Solutions, based on the results we've achieved in their operational scaling project. Patricia made it clear that her interest in working with Sterling and Partners is contingent on my direct involvement in the engagement." Another partner, James Morrison, leaned forward. "And the other companies you mentioned?" "Similar situations," David said. "Each of these relationships is based on my specific expertise and previous results. They're interested in Sterling and Partners because I'm here, not the other way around." David watched as the senior partners exchanged glances. He could see them processing the implications of what he had just presented. For 8 months, they had treated David as a competent but limited consultant who needed to be carefully managed and selectively deployed. Now they were realizing that he had quietly become one of their most valuable business development assets. Richard cleared his throat. "David, this is impressive work, but I want to make sure we understand the client expectations correctly. When you say they specifically requested you, I mean," David interrupted gently, "that they've made it clear that their engagement with Sterling and Partners depends on my leadership of their projects. Quantum Industries, for example, has indicated that they would look elsewhere if I wasn't available to lead their restructuring engagement." The implication was crystal clear, though David never stated it directly. Sterling and Partners could choose to continue limiting his role and lose millions in potential revenue, or they could recognize his value and position him appropriately. Margaret Stevens smiled, and David could see a new respect in her expression. "David, it sounds like you've been quite busy. These are exactly the kind of client relationships that Sterling and Partners needs to develop." "I agree," David replied, "and I believe this represents just the beginning of what's possible. My network includes dozens of similar companies that could benefit from our services, but only if we approach them with the flexibility and innovation they're looking for." Over the next hour, the conversation shifted from David presenting an opportunity to the senior partners, asking him to outline his vision for expanding Sterling and Partners' market presence. They asked detailed questions about his relationship-building strategies, his approach to client development, and his ideas for scaling his success across the firm. By the end of the meeting, Margaret Stevens had offered David a promotion to principal consultant, with responsibility for developing Sterling and Partners' emerging market practice. The role came with a significant salary increase, equity participation, and most importantly, the authority to build client relationships and lead engagements without requiring approval from Richard or other managers. "There's one more thing," David said as the meeting was concluding. "I want to establish a mentorship program for consultants from underrepresented backgrounds. I believe Sterling and Partners is missing opportunities to develop talent that could be particularly effective with the clients I'm targeting." Margaret nodded immediately. "That's an excellent idea. I'd like you to work directly with our Diversity and Inclusion Committee to develop that program." As David left the conference room, he passed Kevin Walsh in the hallway. Kevin's expression was a mixture of confusion and concern as he processed the news that was already spreading through the office. The colleague who had offered David advice about accepting limitations and focusing on appropriate clients was now watching David emerge from a senior partner's meeting with expanded authority and responsibility. "Congratulations," Kevin said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely sure what he was congratulating David for. "Thank you," David replied. "Actually, Kevin, I'll probably be looking for talented consultants to join my new practice. You should let me know if you're interested in working with some really dynamic clients." David continued toward his desk, leaving Kevin standing in the hallway processing the complete reversal of their previous conversation. That afternoon, David called Professor Martinez to share the news. "You did exactly what I hoped you would do," Professor Martinez said. "You stopped asking for permission and started creating value that they couldn't ignore." "The funny thing is," David replied, "I don't think I consciously planned it this way. I was just trying to do good work and build relationships. That's what makes it so effective, Professor Martinez laughed. You weren't playing their game. You were creating a new game entirely. And now they need you to teach them how to play it. 6 months later, David's emerging market practice had generated over $40 million in new revenue for Sterling and Partners. His mentorship program had attracted top talent from diverse backgrounds, and 3 of his mentees had already been promoted to senior roles. Quantum Industries had become one of the firm's largest clients, and David had been featured in Consulting Magazine as one of the industry's rising stars under 35. Richard, who had once suggested that David focus on community development organizations, now reported to David as part of the emerging market practice team. The transition had been awkward initially, but Richard had adapted to the new dynamic with professional grace. During David's 1-year anniversary celebration at Sterling and Partners, Margaret Stevens gave a speech about the importance of recognizing and developing talent, regardless of traditional expectations. She specifically praised David's ability to identify market opportunities that others had missed and his success in building client relationships that had transformed the firm's growth trajectory. As David looked around the room at his colleagues, he reflected on how completely the situation had changed. A year ago, he had been fighting for recognition and struggling to prove his worth within a system that seemed designed to limit his success. Now he was setting strategy, building teams, and creating opportunities for others who faced similar challenges. The most satisfying part wasn't the promotion or the recognition, though both were gratifying. It was the knowledge that he had changed the game not just for himself, but for the consultants who would come after him. Sterling and Partners would never again be able to claim that certain types of clients preferred certain types of consultants, because David had proven that excellence and results mattered more than appearances and assumptions. David had faced discrimination, but he had responded by demonstrating something that his detractors had never expected. He wasn't just qualified to succeed in their world. He was capable of changing it entirely.